What is PAX exactly?
It's an entity that lends money or lent money in this circumstance to a business known as Shiny Times Holdings.
Do you know any significance to the fact that it's named the Pacific Asia Alliance Opportunity Fund?
I do not.
Do you know where it's based?
I do not.
Do you know if it has a focus on investments in Asia?
I do not.
You didn't represent any of the parties in the PAX litigation, right?
I did not.
So your familiarity with that case comes purely from reading documents filed in it, right?
And hearing about the case in bankruptcy proceedings, but yes.
All second-hand information, right?
Correct.
You didn't attend any of the hearings in the PAX litigation, right?
I did not.
You didn't intervene in any way in the PAX litigation, correct?
Correct.
And when Mr. Ferguson was asking you questions about the PAX litigation, he went over with you the documents that he would like you to read from, correct?
Yes.
And he went over with you the questions that he was likely to ask you, right?
Not specifically.
Well, I'm not saying he asked you the specific questions. Generally speaking, he told you what he'd like you to talk about, right?
Correct.
Mr. Ferguson asked you some questions about a state court order in the PAX litigation. Do you remember that?
He asked me about several state court orders, I believe.
Let me be specific. I meant the one granting summary judgment. Do you remember that?
Yes.
When the summary judgment order was granted, that meant that there was effectively obligation for Mr. Guo to pay some money, right?
Yes.
And that was north of $100 million, right?
Yes.
And I think you testified that PAX was seeking to collect on that judgment, right?
Once that judgment was entered, yes.
After the judgment was entered, PAX was making efforts to collect, right?
Yes.
And Mr. Guo wasn't paying it, right?
Correct.
Now, from your experience in the bankruptcy case, you're aware that Mr. Guo claimed in that case that PAX is controlled by the CCP, right?
Yes.
And, in fact, the protest that you refer to against PAX, Mr. Guo linked those also to the CCP, right?
I believe that was his claim.
And the same with the protest against the trustee, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware that Mr. Guo claims in that motion included that the trustee had scuttled a settlement between PAX and Mr. Guo's counsel?
I'm sorry. I don't recall a particular motion that was filed by Mr. Kwok related to the negotiations or mediation. That was your question?
In any bankruptcy filing that you're aware of in Mr. Guo's bankruptcy proceeding, are you aware of him making accusations that Mr. Despins had scuttled the settlement agreement between PAX and Mr. Guo?
No.
Now, leading into, the protest against Mr. Despins began in November of 2022, correct?
It was fall of 2022. I don't recall the exact date or month, but it was in the fall of 2022.
Around that time you're aware that Mr. Guo made a motion to disqualify Mr. Despins in the bankruptcy case?
My recollection is that motion was prior to the protest.
Sure, it was not immediately coincidental, but it was before, right?
Yes.
And as part of that motion, Mr. Guo's lawyer accused the trustee of being part of the CCP?
I don't recall that accusation.
Let me see if I can help you with that. Let me put up just for the witness and the parties. Can I have just one moment, Your Honor, DX 60658, just for the witness and the parties. Can we just scroll through that document for the witness? We can take that down actually. Sorry, let's move on. Let's go back to the PAX case for a second, okay? Now, there was first an initial contempt order filed in the PAX case, correct?
Yes.
That's a conditional contempt order of some sort.
I believe it was referred to as the initial contempt order.
Whatever the term, there was one first and then there was one later, correct?
Yes.
And the first one fined Mr. Guo $500,000 a day, until the Lady May was returned to New York, correct?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Guo faced potential time if he didn't comply, correct?
The official contempt order made no reference to jail time or additional fines. My recollection is that contempt order provided 60 days for Mr. Kwok to return the Lady May to the jurisdiction before the fines would start being levied.
Okay, and the yacht didn't come back though, right?
It did not.
Okay, do you know where the yacht was at that time?
Based on the pleadings, it was indicated the boat or the yacht was in Europe.
Okay, do you know if Mr. Guo was in Europe at that time?
I do not.
Okay, now there were court hearings in New York in the PAX litigation, correct?
Yes.
You testified about an evidentiary hearing, right?
Yes.
Mr. Guo was at those hearings, right?
I believe so.
Okay, so he wasn't in Europe at those times, right?
The evidentiary hearing was in February of 2022. I believe he was in New York for that hearing.
Okay, now the PAX had also obtained a summary judgment order by this time, correct?
By February of 2022, yes.
Sorry, I meant by the time of the first contempt order going out.
Yes.
Okay, now Mr. Guo didn't use any money from G clubs to pay that underlying summary judgment order, right?
No money was used to pay that summary judgment.
Right, so not G clubs money, not GTV money, not Himalaya Exchange money. No money, right?
Correct.
It went unsatisfied, correct?
Yes.
And in early 2022, PAX moved for the final contempt order, right?
Yes.
And the court granted that on November 9th, is that right?
I believe it was February 9th, 2022.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Thank you. February 9th, right?
Yes.
2022, and the total fees/fines that Mr. Guo had to pay were $134 million, correct?
Yes.
Could we pull up GX 1413 at 2, please? Does everybody have it on their screens? Okay, let me just give that a second. Okay, great, thank you. Alright, so paragraph 2 there says, directed to tender immediate payment to PAX, correct?
Yes.
And the amount is $134 million, right?
Yes.
And then on paragraph 4, it says, payment of the amount set forth in paragraph 2 above, shall be made to PAX within 5 business days of the service of this order, with notice of entry, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so Mr. Guo's deadline to comply I think was February 16, 2022, correct?
I believe that's correct. 5 business days. I didn't pull out a calendar, but I believe there's probably a weekend day in there, and so that is probably accurate.
Right. Well, let me put it this way. He filed his bankruptcy petition on February 15, 2022, right?
Yes.
And that was the day before he was going to have to pay this, right?
Yes.
And I think you testified about it. There's a weekend in there, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, so the bankruptcy judge, withdrawn. The state court judge ordered Mr. Guo to pay more than $100 million in basically a week, right?
Yes.
And Mr. Guo didn't use G Club's money to pay that either, right?
Correct.
He didn't use Himalaya Exchange money to pay that, right?
Correct.
He didn't use GTV money to pay that, right?
Correct.
He didn't use rule of law donations to pay that, right?
Correct.
And Mr. Guo did face potential jail time if he violated this contempt order, correct?
That's my understanding.
And despite that, he still did not use any of that money to pay this fine, correct?
Correct.
Now instead, Mr. Guo filed bankruptcy, right?
He did file bankruptcy, yes.